great to be here.
Yeah, it was good. It was a good gathering in that. We've had a lot going, and I think there are more and more people cottoning on, as they say, to the idea, and it's an extremely significant one. So I'm really glad we can get another time here for you to elaborate. Maybe we can build on what we've done before. And welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Robert Ashford. He's a professor of law at the College of Law at Syracuse University and the co-author of the book Binary Economics. He's an exponent of a system of thinking of economics called binary economics that is extremely significant in terms of the way the world is going to become to organize itself. And Bob, welcome once again to our Studio 36, and we can get a chance to have a discussion with you before you catch your transportation back to Syracuse.
Good. It was excellent to be here.
Yeah. We've done another program. We've been meeting with a number of people here in New York, and it seemed to me, I was just chatting as we started, that more and more people seem to be, the old-fashioned expression is cottoning on. They're beginning to understand the significance of this, what had been to a large extent in terms of the overall thinking of economic theory, marginalized notion of binary economics. But what do you think? Maybe you've shared some of the background before, but maybe you could talk a little bit about it. We could reiterate some of the basic premises that you're so familiar with.
Well, first of all, I think you're right. I think that it's true that more and more people are beginning to comprehend the significance of binary economics, including some economists, which is, I think wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago.
If I'm not mistaken, Lewis used to say he thought the professional economist might be the last to understand it. If I'm not mistaken,
There is a certain notion that you have to be outside a paradigm to embrace it. I think it was C.S. Lewis who wrote that I'm not a great fan of the received wisdom or the common wisdom.
Conventional wisdom.
Conventional wisdom, he said, because all important discoveries run contrary to the conventional wisdom.
That's right. Marshall McLuhan used to observe that you have to be outside the fishbowl in order to see it whole. If you're swimming around in the water, you have a hard time being able to comprehend the new, outside new dimension.
That's right. So binary economics, you could summarize it in different ways, but the way Lewis Kelso would summarize it is that labor and capital are independently productive. Each one contributes to production with its own contribution. The conventional notion is that capital makes labor more productive. But the binary notion is that labor and capital are independent producers. So comparing
maybe we could stop there for a second. That's a radical idea.
Yeah, it doesn't seem...
And it would seem in a certain conventional sense that everybody would sort of, in a sense, understand that steam shovels and things are important to production. But in terms of economic theory, that's not really drawn. The ownership of the capital instruments is not drawn as an interesting or important variable.
It's the ownership that is submerged. Everybody will admit that capital is important to greater production. That was what Adam Smith was looking at, that accumulating wealth of nations. But he saw it in terms of the fact that capital makes labor more productive. With a tool, a person can dig more, do all sorts of things more. I guess a good example is you saw 10 boards an hour by hand, 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. The machine saws more, makes the person more productive than the hand saw.
So they're focusing on the person doing the sawing rather than on the independent productiveness of the saw itself.
Now,
or the ownership of the saw. Maybe that's what's important as a source of production or as an instrument of production, and also as an instrument potentially of distribution of income if the ownership can be more widely shared, perhaps.
Now, I think the audience probably needs an example of what do we mean by independent productiveness. You don't see it so much in the saw because it can be obscured. You can give that output to the human. But let's suppose you want to haul a sack a mile. You do it yourself, you're exhausted. It's a heavy sack. But you can put 5 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. Now the horse, which is capital, has done much more than make the person more productive. The horse is doing most of the extra work. And then if you put 10,000 sacks on a truck and you turn the ignition key, you're driving in an air-conditioned cab, do 50,000 sack miles worth of work. The binary notion says that the truck is doing really most of the extra work. Capital both does more work and distributes more income. And once you recognize that that's the case, then we have a word called productiveness.
Okay, good. Now, wait a minute. Wait 1 minute. Let's pause for a minute, people. What you just said is so obvious.
It's obvious.
It's obvious. And then you could take it to a train with a whole load of coal being brought. Sure. It's so obvious. What is there? I mean, it'd be like saying the sun is in the sky or something like that. Why is it that that is not recognized, or is not recognized in terms of the way we organize our society? Maybe we stop at that level for the audience who's viewing. They say, well, of course the train.
There are many reasons.
You know what I'm saying?
There may be many reasons. There's certain psychological, social, spiritual, different dimensions to it. But one thing is clear, and we learned it from Thomas Kuhn in his wonderful book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, and that is we think in paradigms.
Yeah.
So if you start with a false premise,
right,
and you're locked into that false premise,
right,
then everything follows from that false premise, seems to be logical. And I give the best example is the sunrise. Every morning we see the sunrise, the clouds are not there, and every evening we see the sunset, but it's a complete illusion. The sun does not rise, the sun does not set.
Right.
It's an illusion built on a false premise. So if you're firmly fixed on the notion that the Earth is the center, it's easy to miss the idea that it could be the other way around.
You know, and people get their identities, and I wonder if I could just parse that out a little bit. Maybe a false premise, or there's also things change through time, so that a premise that was valid in a certain context becomes not valid in terms of a new emerging context.
Or if maybe it was not valid in the first place, but it wasn't consequential.
Okay, right.
I mean, you could always say that capital was doing work. You know, if one believes in evolution, for example, fruit trees and berry trees and bushes, and they were feeding us before we were human.
That's from the land, Lord George.
And if you believe in special creation, you know, the Lord created things first, and
created design,
and then we ended up we're the beneficiaries of that. So it's always true, but it gets more and more significant when capital instruments are doing more and more of the work. If you compare,
which has been the course of human societal development.
If you compare our present economy in the USA to 50, 100, 200 years ago, the difference isn't that people are working any harder or smarter. The real difference is all of these capital instruments. And so the binary notion says there's two things about capital that's important. First of all, it does vastly more work than labor can do, even though it takes labor to help it along. And the second thing is that the distribution of its ownership is highly significant. And it may come as a surprise to your audience to know that left-wing economics and right-wing economics and mixed centrist economics, and that's all we have that's advising our government and our institutions and our businesses, all of those are premised on the notion that the distribution of ownership of capital is not a fundamentally important proposition. Now, they may say the distribution or the redistribution of income is important, but not the distribution of ownership. And what's the difference? You know, if people are poor, you can pick the fruit from the tree owners and give it to the poor people, or you can enable the poor people to acquire trees. And when you enable the poor people and working people to acquire trees, then you don't have to pick the trees from the rich.
What if we get back up?
That's ownership.
Yeah, if we go back up in a primer kind of way, back to where you were talking about the paradigm shift and sort of forth. I know the Catholic Church only just let Galileo off the hook about 10 years ago for having come up with the heliocentric theory that came from advancing knowledge. We come to know things more and it becomes obvious. But people had their identity wrapped up in the paradigm is not only institutions, it's also thought patterns and individual personal sense of identity. And if something comes that's going to challenge the basic premises, put it in quotes, notion by which people get a sense of purpose and identity in a fundamental way, that's going to be very, very difficult. I wonder if it's possible to take that same notion it was when you go to a heliocentric world, the notions of Earth as the center of the universe. Hieronymus Bosch paintings show the agony that they were going through in that. Now we're coming to a time where the technology is more and more important. And then what is there about that at an identity level, people gain income for their life's purposes and in a very real sense for the purpose of their being in a materialistic sense and so forth by doing some sort of a function for which they are either rewarded or punished, or if they learn the ability to do it so they can earn a living by their own effort and so forth. And now we're coming along in a certain sense and saying, well, that effort that you are putting into that process is not nearly as important as that. It's a paradigm shift that challenges the means by which people, on large, get their sense of identity, and institutions reify that kind of a view of the world. And it seems to me there might be something important in that, in terms of people having a difficulty understanding something new, like they did with the heliocentric notion of the universe that challenged their sense of identity before that. I'm talking about the citizens.
Sure. Well, the shifting from the Earth in the center of the solar system to the sun took us away.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's not our human productivity
yes, our
that
hard
is producing
work.
this.
Yes.
So in a sense...
Or the work ethic.
That's right. That's
yeah.
exactly it.
Yeah.
Now, and what's important to recognize, though, is that the truth has a power to set us free. And if we have a more humble notion of what humans can do, and a more respectful notion of what the non-human can do, and the capital is all those things that can be owned, which is non-human.
Yeah.
We have a respect for that. It actually is a very liberating concept.
It does seem that way to me, but most of our movies where they put the power in the hands of something other than actual human activity and thought processing are movies like The Terminator, or the machines are going to come and mow us down.
That's the enemy.
They don't see the technology as something that could be liberating, and they just see it as a threat to the means by which they have a sense of where they're going to go on Monday to a thing they're going to do that's going to give them an earn. Do you understand? That they don't have the right attitude toward technology, perhaps, which is the big variable that's changing in the modern experience.
Well, the reason people are afraid of technology is most people are excluded from owning it. Owning its instantiated representation.
I heard you use that term. That's great. Instantiate is going to be a big word.
The concept of a truck is a concept.
Yeah.
But owning the truck is the instantiation of that, or the automobile, or the rocket, or whatever it is you're talking, or the computer.
Yeah.
That's the physical representation. If you are not able to acquire the physical representation of this powerful technology, you're going to feel alienated and threatened by it. What people don't recognize is that once you see that capital does its own work,
okay, that's the machine.
The machine, the non-human factor does its own work. The horse, the truck. Then you see, capital has 6 powers, and I have to feel that we go. Capital replaces labor.
All right, it's a biggie. Let's stop there for a minute here. Replaces labor. Okay,
that means you give
worker. No, to people who think, oh, okay, here comes a piece of technology that can do away with my function in this society, by which I get my sense of identity, which is to go to the job and do the appointed thing in a way that is going to reward me with income so I can buy bread to let my kids eat. And in the Depression, we had unemployment, and that accounts for poverty, penury, and all those things that people have been geared throughout a long history of scarcity and not enough to be absolutely fearful of, so they will run in terror from the idea that the technology is going to replace them in the productive process because it threatens their identity.
But they don't realize that there's a perfectly wonderful way in which they can acquire the technology that replaces their labor, and with the ownership of the technology, they have leisure. The person with a horse...
Leisure, they had leisure in the Depression. You could be leisured to be unemployed and poverty-struck. You could be a hobo.
Well,
but leisure with a competence or with sufficiency to meet your material needs is a different proposition than leisure to starve.
That's right. Well, the right to life assumes the right for the resources to support life.
Yes.
And unless you're going to be a ward of charity, that means you need to be productive. But
in the way things that are actually being produced. Right. Do you think it's important if people are actually linked to the way things are actually produced, or can we have a shell game where we make sure that everybody has a thing they can do in the name of labor that they're going to contribute, and you can make pyramids, or you can have them do anything, as long as to keep that notion alive, that paradigm notion by which, again, I come back to, they get their sense of identity from. That's going to be resistance if they're
Well, again, I think it has to do with coming to peace with the importance of private property, and the idea that the distribution of private property to everybody is a crucial factor. We haven't talked about a great puzzle and that is this issue of unutilized productive capacity.
Okay.
Harold, if I made you the czar of the world, we've said this before, and said feed and clothe and shelter the world. However difficult it'd be in this year, 2005, it'd be easier than 1905 or 1805. Why do we have this unutilized productive capacity? And if I said, Harold, you're still the czar of the world, but instead of wanting to feed and clothe and shelter the world, your goal is to make more unutilized productive capacity. Just the way the pharaohs love pyramids, you love unutilized. Or we could create more. If it's not
there's a saying. What is it? Is it one of the laws is that work expands to fill the time available to do it, or something? And you can fill all kinds of things. Have all kinds of things people can do doing things. You know. And we see that in the real world.
But if it's not productive, it doesn't add to the sum of value and the sum of wealth that we have.
I wonder if we could pause for a moment. What we're saying is the value of the activity by an individual in the productive process is not equal to or is not relevant to the overall productiveness of the economy as a whole. The value of the individuals to contribution to production is not valuable. Well, ultimately, it's not valuable. Now, that's a paradigm shift in terms of the means by which people get a sense, overwhelmingly in our modern society, from their participation in society. That's an identity thing, and that goes right to the core of a person's soul.
Well, the issue of value is important. I wouldn't go so far as to say that that labor is not valuable. I would simply say that increasingly capital is the more productive variable. So the technology may be seen to make labor more productive, but technology makes capital much more productive than labor, and that's the issue. So it's important to value labor, but it's also important not to obscure the importance of the capital.
As is the case by and large. We got the Employment Act in 1946. We distribute all income in the American or world economy by people having what they call a job.
We have a policy, whether you're a Democrat or Republican.
We say the president has a job, you know.
Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, your strategy typically is capital acquisition for the rich. And jobs and welfare for everyone else.
That's the way it was with the feudal lords.
But the binary notion realizes that the poor have to be able to acquire capital very much the same way the rich do. And you know how the rich acquire capital mostly?
Retained earnings.
With the earnings of capital. Not with the earnings of labor.
Well, that was the way, if you do it.
And that's the binary rule. The binary rule is if you believe in binary economics as a truthful approach, your goal would be to enable everybody, not just the rich, enable everybody to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Well,
not with the earnings of labor, but the earnings of capital.
You're advancing then a notion which is another way of seeing things, because it's always been that way. We had the emperors of Rome. We had the feudal lords in the dynastic states of Europe for 1,000 years.
And they were built on slavery.
They owned all the land. They had slaves. Aristotle's Athens, they had a few people who lived well, but it was all based on slavery. And so it has been ever throughout all of human history. You had a few people who owned all the means of production and had all the power, and they could do what they want. But the masses of the people, mostly wallowing around in the mud of dire poverty, were made to do what it is that those masters wanted them to do, and so it's
to liberate the masters.
So what you're talking about is a democratic notion. We say you're wanting to democratize
capital ownership.
We want to democratize things, and so it's a democratic notion of having the relationship to the production, rather than being in all the few hands like the feudal lords or King Louis XVI. Remember what happened to him. That it's got to be distributed to everyone else, so they'll be in touch with the way things are actually being produced because of the technological changes evolving into a new zeitgeist and a new context or a new paradigm on the planet.
That's right. Now, when you use the word absolutely, when you use the word democratic, I think it's important to know that, unfortunately, many people who live in societies we call democratic have an incomplete notion of what we mean by democracy. The conventional notion would be it's majority rule, power comes from the people, the majority rule, subject to certain inalienable rights, regardless of what the majority says.
Protect the rights of the minority and freedom of speech. And all that.
So that's a political notion. Now, a binary economist knows that there are really two elements to democracy. One is the democratization of political power, which we see represented in universal voting and the delegation of power through that. And then there's also the democratization of economic power. And when you say that, you have to realize that the essence of democracy is universal, individual participation.
Now say that one again.
Universal individual participation.
That's a liberated order at the level of the individual participant in the system.
And participation in what? In the political process and the economic process.
Particularly the economic, I would say, it's more important to most people that they have an ability to lead their own life according to their own lights by having a competence or a sufficiency of income to be able to lead and do what they want, than to be able to vote every 4 years in an election that all adds up to a Madison Avenue ad campaign.
Well, at least they're equipotent, and I think the importance should be. Well, I would succeed in introducing this idea in the world if we can just see that at least they're equipotent and we put them both on the table, and the economic component is the right to produce goods and services, which includes the right to produce services by labor, if you want to go in the labor market, but also the right to produce services in the capital market by acquiring capital with the earnings of capital, and then living on the income after the capital is produced.
And that's your landlords in the feudal estate, and that's your capitalists in the modern economy that has not been informed by the binary notion that everybody has to be an owner. Right. Only they're like slaves. And Marxists call them wage slaves, and to a real degree that's the case. They set the template for the whole society, the bankers, or the ones who do that, and then everyone has to fit into that, so they're going to be a little bit reluctant to try and think about something to change, because they're kings of the world. They will want to change, and Louis XVI didn't either.
But what they don't realize, or what maybe some of them realize in obscure, is that the present system of concentrated ownership is the reason why we have unutilized productive capacity. And if we enable all people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, we're going to get a growth in the economy, which is represented by the productive growth that enables people to acquire shoes that they couldn't acquire before, clothing, shelter, basic medical care, transportation, communication, safety for their children. These things can then be acquired. This is all a growth factor that is unleashed by broader ownership. And that's what the left wing and the right wing do not see.
That's right.
Or if they see it, they suppress it.
They see it in an ideological term. I mean, that growth thing could apply to a lot of even the supply-siders, Mundell, and those kind of people could understand it. It would apply to their thing, and it would apply also to the equity requirements and justice that the left wing tends to concentrate on.
So you could summarize binary economics very much like you could summarize Newton's laws in a single sentence: force equals mass times acceleration, which only made sense after we got the Earth going around the sun.
Really? It didn't make sense. Really?
No, if you assume that the sun goes around the Earth, Newton's laws do not hold.
Is that right? That's it. They're trying to work out those elliptical pathways to make them work.
There's no reason why Jupiter or Saturn should suddenly begin revolving around the sun.
I like that analogy. That's great, because that's what's going to dawn as far as this notion of economics you're talking about. It will come to be, there are such contradictions, you can't justify them anymore. And so they're going to have to get on with something new outside the box.
And once people recognize that capital is independently productive, then the capital that right now profitably buys itself for a few people can become even more profitable if it's buying itself for many, because the promise of broader ownership, which is a promise that capital will first buy itself, and after it's bought itself, then distribute income to new owners who will buy the products of capital.
Yeah, capitalists understand that very well. Yeah.
The idea that broader ownership and a promise of broader ownership means you have an incentive to employ in time two, means you have an incentive to employ capital in time one, and an incentive to invest in more capital in time one. Demand for consumer goods.
Well, no, because
it must lead the demand for producer goods.
Well, what you're talking about, in a certain sense, if I may, and what we're getting to is you're doing something that's called like simulfinance. You're going to build supply, and you're going to build the capability to demand, or the income distribution to clear the market of what it's capable to do and cut that gap in
the simultaneously.
Unutilized productive capability.
But the simultaneous notion has to be understood in the context
of a paradigm.
And of a period of time in which capital
That
is a variable investment.
That's right. That period of time be now, brother. This is ever was needed. This is just about now.
Well,
what we're talking about. This is really relevant to the everyday world.
Somebody once said that insanity is the idea that you can do the same thing over and over again and come up with a different result.
Yeah, right.
We've tried the left-wing theory.
Yeah.
We've tried the right-wing theory, and we still have growing unutilized productive capacity and poverty and exclusion and alienation. By enabling capital to acquire itself for increasing numbers of people, as again, you could summarize the binary notion by saying the more broadly capital is acquired, the more we will employ our unutilized productive capacity, and the more we will promote growth. How big is the growth potential? At least as big as the unutilized productive capacity that
Well, now, the unutilized productive capacity is understood by some people saying, well, we've got plant X, 7, 8, 9, 10. We add up how much steel could they produce, and that's that. But you got a notion about unutilized productive capacity that goes, no, it could be to have an inflection point or an idea that goes beyond just dealing with the gap between what a plant could turn out and what the market could would bring. It could become a thing where you're actually getting to where you're transcending the historical condition in which everything was done. You could be getting that. You could be transcending scarcity in an ontologic sense for everybody, a liberating kind of world which heralds a massively seen liberation that is trying to be found, and is the fact that is not offered might have a great deal to do with the political instability that so roils this earth at the moment. Well, I mean, we're at a major break point. Perhaps in a large paradigm of paradigms.
Well, one thing is for sure, and that is to say that the more we broaden ownership, the more we will employ unutilized productive capacity, and the more we will promote growth. That is the essence of binary economics. And to say, you're right that the economists, if you were to poll physicists, chemists, religious leaders, poets, artists of all sorts, sociologists, anthropologists, and ask them whether we have unutilized productive capacity in the 20th century more than
absolutely.
But to the economists,
impossible.
To the economists, it's a debatable no. But that's because they have a very stingy,
parsimonious
notion of unutilized. They look at the numerator as being existing plant and equipment and employees that you're not using over a denominator of total existing. But economics works over a period of time. Think about the additional capacity we could make.
Absolutely, that's what I was trying to say.
Once you hold capital to be a variable.
Well, you've opened a vision upon a condition that is liberating of the conditions in which people had to suffer. But then again, that's introducing a change that is going to be so altering. Can you imagine a world? No, but can you imagine grandchildren, a world of, let's say, let's just take it to the extreme, affluently leisured individual people. Affluently leisured, individually level, a planet of that. Can you imagine that in terms of a possibility that people would not have to fit into the design schema of green shaded eyes accountants and investment bankers who are saying we can only do this much because we have to make sure that they are all fitting into our notion of what they have to do in order to be participating. A liberated plan, that is very worrying to people. They think that would be anarchy. What would the poor devils do if they didn't have our pattern to do what we tell them they have to do in order to get a piece of bread to eat, and they were liberated? That's a very liberating order of a view of things over a decade or two.
Well, that's.
You understand?
I think some people are. I think some people who are afraid to liberate people by the broader ownership of private property.
The slave owners were. The slave owners didn't want to let the slaves be free.
Well, that's correct. But even today, where we don't need the labor of most people,
that's a really another.
They would rather have it. They would rather not have them free. But
you got to control the little devil.
But it is important for your audience to understand that binary economics is its impact, if implemented, is gradual. You know, you put an acorn in the ground and it doesn't immediately become an oak tree. It has to grow slowly. So before the audience begins worrying about a population where they have to do almost no work, and they're totally free to maybe get in trouble.
Well, no, they can do what they want to do, and that's the last thing in the world control freaks want. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Oh.
Before you get to the point. Where people are earning 90 and 95% of their income from capital, and so they're free, according to those that are afraid to get in trouble. Long before we get to that point, we're going to be early in the stage, a point where people are earning 3% of their income capital. And then 4, and then 5. So you're only 7, then 13, then 7. So this is a gradual process. Liberation will come gradually. So it's not as though we have to worry. I mean, while people are starving, let's not worry about how it's going to be 100 years from now. Why don't we look at it right now, next 5 years, 10 years? If we can get, and it's a much more civilized way of doing things.
Well, it is much more, and it's also very heartening because that's the way it would be. We understand it. But that does not take away from the fact that in a paradigm sense, one can look at where it's going. You could have looked as an inflection point. And it's maybe if you look that big thing in the eye, it's worth part of the consideration of where is this heading, rather than just saying everything's going to be okay, we can muddle through, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. They can hold on to the old. Particularly if you're a freelance intellectual, you can do that. In 1905, he came up with special theory of relativity. We're celebrating that now. That was an inflection point. It was going to be a change. It created a different kind of world. But there's not to be ruled out the idea of having some idea of where are we going. It's going to be a slow, but we're going to get there. We don't have, I'm saying there's a point where that can be argued and then brought it out on the table front and center and does not have to be ignored in order to keep it quiet, so you might get some gradual change, even though we understand that it is going to be changed like an acorn going into an oak over time.
I mean, I think you're certainly right that it's good to know theoretically where your end point is. But the reason I find that sort of thinking, at least when you study the barriers to why binary economics is not accepted, it's one of the techniques by which it's excluded. So you might get somebody engaged in a conversation and say, well, are you concerned about poor and working people? Oh, yes, I am. You're concerned about suffering? Oh, yes, I am. Well, here's this binary approach that will enable people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, employ and utilize productive capacity because the broader ownership will support more consumption, and we can begin to... They say, well, wait a minute now. I'm concerned. What happens when we get to the end point and everybody has everything? Doesn't this... Now, I said, well, wait a minute, sir, I thought you were a ma'am. I thought you were concerned about poor and working people. Why do you let your concern about 100 years from now deflect you from the process of helping people now?
Great. So that's one way to look at it. That's one way to look at it.
I've seen it happen.
That's beautiful. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is we're trying to just do a little math. Don't worry, everything's going to be all right. You're going to have your slaves. Everybody's going to be a slave. It's going to be like everything's going to be okay. We're going to connect with history. It's going to be there. Don't worry, Mr. Big Shot. It's going to be okay. Well, don't worry, Mr. Everything's okay. We'll keep the slaves there. And that gets in the way of being able to see the idea that there's nothing wrong with an ecologically appropriate, liberated humanity in the fullness of time, particularly for my granddaughters, and put the sucker on the table. There's room for that as well. Big idea. Get the idea out. Let people bring it instead of trying to marginalize everything, any kind of a notion like that, by things that are appealing to the people who are caught up in history. I mean, that's the role not of the people in business or in politics. It's the role of the independent intellectual to do that because you're not bound by the conditions of what do we have to do to satisfy the people who are trying to maintain the old way. There's room for that as well.
There is room for that. And intellectuals and people who say they're concerned, they have, I think, an obligation to study this idea.
Absolutely.
And when I'm going to return to that in just a moment, but I would say that it's important to recognize that this fundamental principle of binary economics, that capital does its own work, it has independent productiveness, this notion, and that the more broadly it's acquired, the more we will use our capacity to feed, clothe, and shelter people, and the more growth we'll have, green growth. Now, it's important to notion that that way of helping poor and working people does not involve redistribution.
Absolutely.
And it's important to pause for a minute because when you look at the struggle, and here's when I teach at law school, law students, I say, let's suppose we get you students to represent the poor and working people. So they're your clients. So don't worry about how this idea works for you. Think about how it works for your client.
Well, think that way about the others.
And so you're trying to help your client. And you look at 150 years worth of political struggle. Tell me how successful have you been helping poor and working people? They say, well, somewhat successful. I say, now what is the biggest barrier politically to the idea of helping poor and working people? The biggest barrier is that when you help poor and working people, other than by letting them work for themselves, work in the market, when you help them with welfare or inflated wages and other kinds of things to transfer, when you tax people to pay for, you're redistributing, and redistribution is a drag on growth, a drag on incentives. But the binary notion says, no, wait a minute, no, you only get the growth when you have the broader distribution of ownership.
That's right.
So it is non-redistributionary. So people need
big difference between non-redistribution and distribution of a bigger pie.
The interesting thing is that there are two major groups of thinkers that have insisted, no, this is redistribution. One is the right wing that says, no. The pie is as big as it can be with our wise investment and our creation of jobs and
the
wealth.
Investment bankers.
But then the other group is the left wing that says, no, this is really redistribution. And I say, now, if you're a lawyer working for your client, don't let the left wing and the right wing tell you
that's what you're looking for. Something that's subsuming them both.
That's exactly right.
And then you're going to have trouble with the politicals and the Trotskyites.
So what I would urge, again, now we've been talking in a way that if you look at a member of your audience who maybe has never heard of this before, they may say, I can't get the whole coherence of it. Let me suggest this. Binary economics is in fact no more complicated than plain geometry. And is probably less complicated.
Plain geometry.
Plain geometry. And although plain geometry is beyond some percentage of the population, the truth of the matter is, my belief is that at least 50% of the people could study plain geometry and get at least a B.
A B or C minus, C plus,
at least
a gentleman's C.
They would have a comprehension.
And it's not as complicated as solid geometry.
And it's not and binary economics is not as complicated.
Do you think the economists who understand things and talk so much and everything understand it as though it's solid geometry? They can only be understood by their sacerdotal class. They're the priesthood class.
But notice that you can't wing plain geometry.
You can't wing it.
You've got to do the reading.
No cliff.
You've got to do the reading.
Yeah, right.
Now, there are ways for your audience to come to an understanding of binary economics. One way,
how about you get your book?
Would be to read this book called Binary Economics.
Let me show the audience. You can see what it looks like. It's called Binary Economics, the New Paradigm.
That's one way.
You've heard it from me if you watch Conversations endlessly. This is the way in which the Earth is going to come to be liberated.
Now, this is a book, I want to say,
level.
This is a book that has actually a lot of repetition in it.
Yes.
And it is written for the common man or woman.
You can't see it there. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
For the common man or woman, the generalist who doesn't have to have a great mathematical ability, doesn't have to have a high sophistication. It's written for anybody, and the book is available. And my concern is that it continue to be in print. So now, for those of you that can't shell out the or feel that you want an introduction before you shell out the money for
get in touch with you. You could send them a paper.
You've got my email there.
Yeah, we're going to put it up at
free emails
or they could do
summaries of binary.
Or people could very well.
But you got to do the homework.
Yeah, you got to think.
You can't approach this idea with a left-wing orientation or a right-wing orientation or a mixed centrist orientation.
You just said
cannot approach this idea.
No, but that represents what you just said. Represents about 99.9 as far as the horizon goes. Thinking about things social, economic, and political.
Most people think that the most important thing about capital is it makes labor more productive.
Yeah.
And that's an illusion.
Yeah.
The most important thing about capital is it does more and more of the work, and it distributes more and more of the income in a perfectly free market, which we don't have.
Yeah, no.
And therefore would support
a free market.
Well, you can't. When almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital,
that's
almost no capital is acquired with the earnings of labor.
Right.
How can it be a free market if almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital? And only 1% of the people own 50% of the wealth and 10% own 90%. Most people have a negative net worth. So the markets cannot be efficient.
Most people only got a decent net worth by the appreciation of real estate over the long haul. People in the middle. And that was FHA helped that happen so they could get some net worth and think they're making progress. Or a few entrepreneurs do. And they say, go out entrepreneur, work hard. And the work ethic, that's the thing you're going to challenge in the ultimate thing. This idea that if I work hard, I'm going to get rewarded. It's a behavioral psychologist's dream world of mazes you can run through. And if you don't do it right, you're going to be poor and awful. And if you do it right, you're going to be able to build your own success. Napoleon Hill and all that.
It's very homocentric. And we don't realize the huge contribution that capital makes. And I would like to just very quickly.
And let's say it's technology. Well, everything other than human
technology
activity.
Is a fancy word for knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge in and of itself.
Applied knowledge.
Well,
it's not just thought. It's applied knowledge in instruments that have effect upon things. Like the truck is not a thought.
Is the truck technology, or is it technology that makes the truck very possible? I would argue that
is it a chicken or is it an egg?
Well, that's a different story. If you believe in evolution, the egg came first, and if you believe in special creation, the chicken came first. So I don't.
Special creation. I never heard that. I heard creative design.
Well,
that's Behe and those guys. There's more to be said for creative design. I don't think you can label it with creationism. Well, I mean, that's another side issue.
It is another issue.
But it's serious, that creative design.
But the reality is that people have to come to a recognition that capital is producing most of the work, and its distribution is of critical significance. And one needs to do the reading necessary to achieve that understanding.
And there have been pace setters said, and of course we're talking about the work of Louis Kelso. It'd be worth mentioning that he studied with him. He was the original, and he did with Mortimer Adler wrote that book that would be recommended.
Yes.
The Kappa is
Capitalist Manifesto.
Interesting title. The Capitalist Manifesto. Yes. I would ask you, Mr. Nixon said in 1972, we're all Keynesians now, and I've asked you, what are we all now? And his is the thing to which we could go if we want to have a liberating view of capitalism, the Western thing. If we want to go to a place that gets a grounding, that isn't all diffused among ideologically laden notions of supply side and monetarism and all this kind of thing, if we want something to get a basic grounding for what we're going to do with this planet, that's the place to go. I would suggest. And that can be got, if I may, at the Kelso Institute. That book can be downloaded.
Yes,
it's
you can
on the web
for
free. And it was Mortimer Adler, the great American philosopher, who put his imprimatur and became known as
one
a
of the most
co-author.
important ideas of the 20th century.
And that's what you picked up on. You picked up on that, and you're carrying that very well. And there's some others. You and your co-author, Rodney Shakespeare. It's a huge idea.
It's a hugely important idea. And my position is really very simple on this, and that is to say, it is a very important way of looking at the economic troubles that have not been solved by left-wing theory, right-wing theory, and centrist theory. It is a new way of looking at things.
And if ever the time is called for that,
and the role of that's right. And the role of the lawyer, and the role of the fiduciary, and the role of the charitable institutions that are trying to help the world, the role of the universities, the role of the intellectual, all of these should be to look at new ways of solving problems where the old ways are failing. So you have to suspend belief. You have to suspend belief that the sun goes around the earth before you can fully consider that the earth goes around the sun.
But it's
justice to an idea requires you to suspend belief and counter ideas until you get the whole story.
They'll always try and make the old system work as long as they possibly can. I think it happens in evolution. You have a thing called punctuated equilibrium,
but the
where it comes all at once. The change comes at once.
But the one anomaly which people the one contradiction that people do not fully embrace and do not fully reconcile themselves to is unutilized productive. I go back to that. Unutilized.
Right.
If you think we have no unutilized productive capacity, this theory is not for you. But if you think we could better today feed and clothe and shelter the world and provide people with the resources they need to develop their highest good, and there's something fallacious, something wrong in the system that prevents that from happening compared to 1900 or 1800 or 1700. If you think that this is a major problem, then this is a theory that needs to be understood. Now, there are those that say, where's your proof that binary economics has truth? It's never been tried. There's no
system in place.
And I say my proof
is in the failures of the common era.
Is in the failures of the present approaches to deal with the empirical proof that we have that these other theories are not working, and that binary economics is worth at least the dignity and the study of these others, is this vast and growing unutilized productive capacity.
Vast and growing.
I say.
Vast and growing.
In the broadest sense of the term, of the capacity to create even more unutilized capacity.
You use that term in terms of one that goes really nicely with economic and that unutilized productive capacity and that sort of thing. I wonder if because I use another term, and I don't know if I'm off base, but you understand. We're good friends. We've done this a long time, but I understand that, and we just were at a thing last night at Columbia, weren't we? And we were at a thing that they've got this technological capability that is so destructive now in the atomic bombs. We talked about this being a 100th anniversary of special theory of relativity. You could have had an inflection point that would lead to a situation where you had a weapon systems that, according to Jonathan Schell, and according to increasing numbers of people, Michio Kaku, that we have a weapon system technology built up from a historical development that if it were to be through some accident, like Long Beach gets a thing and then there are consequences from that, that it would mean the end of our species, apparently. Mm-hmm. So we had the bow and arrow, we had the musket, we have the repeating rifle, we have the Gatling gun, we have the tank, we have the dreadnought, we have and now we get to a point where we're so clever at that where we can kill each other, that we can destroy the whole species. An adverse thing, and we crossed that line about 1970, everyone seems to agree. That's what most of the people who look at that very big question. It's a big issue coming to political fruition right now in this particular time frame. The other side of that, which I've always liked, is Bucky Fuller, among others. But Bucky Fuller put it out there more authoritatively from his World Game measuring of human trends in a non-ideologically laden basis of what's actually going on in the evolution of events. He came to the conclusion that we had a greater number of people who could be seen to be halves through time. That's a principle that could be applied in projected trend because of our technological productiveness, increasing productiveness. That we got to a point where by First World War, 10% were halves in a world system scale. Second World War, 20% were in terms of unutilized productive capacity in a living repattern. And he said in 1952 that we were reaching a point where we had a 20-year period of imminent crisis to all human institutions we've inherited from 200,000 years of human evolution and so forth, as we crossed the 50% mark. And in terms of our unutilized productive capability of providing more halves for the first time were on planet Earth in terms of the system's evolution, we were transcending scarcity. Is it possible to equate your notion of unutilized productive capacity for a living eco-good system and so forth could nest with this idea that's going to become very front and center to the intellectuals, that we actually live in an ontological reality, or a reality can't be tested no more than the destructive scenario of the atomic bombs without a real major alteration, but we've transcended scarcity in terms of the evolution of events on the planet. And is that unutilized productive capacity able to be associated with the idea there is enough for all? We actually can set people free for the first time. We don't have to live, as James Joyce said, history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken. Maybe we are awakening, or is that something that is just not relevant?
Well, it's not. Again, we've been through this before.
Yeah.
And my own view is that the principle that capital is independently productive and has a distributive relationship to growth and will work to employ and utilize capacity. And the fact, those things was true in 1910, even before we may have transcended these points. There's a principle that is true.
Right.
And so understanding that.
Yeah.
You don't have to agree that we've already crossed the point of
more haves than have-nots in terms of the in terms of the unutilized productive capacity, not in terms of the.
You do not have to believe that to understand binary economics.
But it doesn't mean they're not ruled out. And I mean, it's like unutilized productive capacity in terms of we have a capability. You say we have more haves than have-nots. We have the capability of transcending it. We don't have the institutions that let us do what we're capable of doing because we have not got the right order in place. Unutilized productive capability to provide for everyone within an ecological context is blowing in the wind, and we're not doing it because we're involved in the history.
All binary economics tells you is we can get, if we haven't gotten there, we can get closer to there.
Okay.
That's all it says.
Well, that's a good start from what we can look at today, don't you think?
Right now, we have a scarcity that may have a number of causes, but the one cause that we can do something about immediately is broadening ownership through this non-redistributionary way. And that can be done. There may be other reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, if, for example, we need aluminum, and we use up all the aluminum, well, there's a scarcity.
Yeah. Right.
Now there are dimensions. If we need a good ozone layer to protect us,
we do, in fact.
And if we're getting a bigger holes,
well, we're getting ecological blowback. Sure. I mean, the signs are all over the place, aren't they?
But that's a scarcity.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So you need good design, not ideologically laden design to protect the past.
You need to understand who and what is producing well, and what it is that it will do something to employ our unutilized capacity, to do better than we are doing now, and to promote growth, and to enable the common man and woman, every man and woman, to be able to acquire some of the property that liberates right now.
That's right.
The wealthiest people.
So they could have a competence to lead a affluently leisured life.
And the trends that we see right now.
Then they could be concerned with the things of the mind and the spirit that are really important, rather than earning a living.
They'll be liberated. That's right. And it's important to realize that the kind of ownership we're talking about right now is full ownership in the sense that the owner gets the full income of the thing that is produced. If you own the horse,
right.
you get the full income of the horse after you've paid the cost of maintaining the horse.
That's important. They got all these tax incentives or other politically organized things.
You get the full income.
Yeah, right.
Now let's just say this. I don't know how much time we have, but
we got about 6 minutes
let me just, because I just want to get them out on the table.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead. I'll shut up.
The 6 powers of capital is important for people to understand.
Right.
Not only does the horse do work, and that's to say the capital does its own work. It does 6 things, and it's important to get them out without stopping and questioning each one of them.
All right. Good. I understand. Okay. Yeah, get it out on the table.
Capital replaces labor. But capital does more than replace labor. It almost always vastly supplements labor. We talk about capital substitution for labor, but we almost never simply put a capitalist in that does the same thing that labor. We almost always, we can't compete with horses or trucks for hauling. So capital almost always vastly supplements labor. That's growth, when you vastly supplement the work of labor with the work of capital. The third thing capital does is does work labor can never do. So it creates a whole new... Now, what do I mean by work that labor can do? I love to tell people a farmer never grew an apple. All a farmer can do is help a tree grow an apple. We marvel at the computers, but we cannot make computer chips.
Not even an Apple computer.
We can guide capital instruments to make computers. We cannot make it. Capital works without labor. Totally liberates us. People say, what do you mean? I say, well, you don't think capital works without labor? Try living without your washing machine. Capital works without labor. That contributes to growth. And those are real powers of capital. Replace, vastly supplement, do work that labor cannot do, work without labor. Those are all real powers. And the 5th and 6th things capital can do, and this is where you appreciate the legal system and the credit system, capital can buy itself on the enforceable promise. It's enforceable. That's
you need rule
the enforceable promise of its future income.
Absolutely.
And that's the way the rich like to acquire capital. They like to buy... They tell the poor, work hard, save, invest
be an
wisely.
entrepreneur.
But most capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, not the earnings of... And the 6th thing capital can do, in the long run, is it can distribute the income necessary to purchase its output. The incremental productive capacity of capital, if acquired by people who have no consumer income now, will distribute to them in a future period, after the capital has paid for itself, consumer income, which will, in the earlier period, create the incentive to employ more unutilized capacity and promote more growth. So those are the 6 powers of capital. And none of them are revealed as long as the left wing and the right wing and the center say the role of capital is to make labor more productive.
That's what you hear. That's 99.999% of what you hear in the public dialogue.
That's right.
So there's something that is not there.
That's what leads to the idea of we need capital acquisition for the rich and jobs and welfare for everyone else.
So I look at this the world we live in.
So I look at this from my own perspective as what's the responsibilities of the lawyer or the fiduciary.
Or the intellectual.
Someone comes to you and says, I'm hungry, Harold. You give them a sandwich. That's the welfare fund. Somebody comes to you and said, you know, I need a job. You help them get a job. Somebody comes to you and says, I need to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, just the way the Rockefellers and the DuPonts do. Now, then you'd help them do that. But our system says the first one's a legitimate demand, the second one's a legitimate demand, but the demand is being able to acquire capital, to be included in a process that is already working well for the rich. That people don't even know to ask for that.
Well, you know,
and that's why I say education. Education.
And Binary Economics is a book to go to, and this is just the scratching the surface of it.
All people need to understand that the most important right today that they are being denied, and needlessly, is the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. People are needlessly denied that right, and that's why we have unutilized productive capacity, and that's why we have suboptimal growth. That's why we have, I think that's why we have a huge military. What does it protect?
Military and all the
private property of the few.
Okay, I understand. That's right. That's the case, and and we don't have a political leadership that's able to address it because they're all caught up within the old thing, trying to make those elliptical pathway orbits work. And the old system is outdated. But I think it's going to come from the intellectuals who can think outside the box of the established institutions which have become outdated. Thank goodness there are a few people outside of the Whigs in the court of Versailles of Louis XVI could begin to think. Voltaire and some others could begin to think there's something new blowing in the wind. They could come up with something new, a vision of something new. And there's a Voltaire of the modern age is you, Louis Kelso. And thank you really very much for participating in this. We might say we're going to have another program with you next week sometime so they could look for that because you've been in town. We've done a couple of programs. This will be an introduction to that. Huge idea, very important, and really thanks for coming in and to our mini studio here. We really appreciate seeing you as always.
Studio
and
36.
Good luck. Studio 36, from which the...
Thank you, Harold.
We're going to make some changes.
Thank you for the good work you do, Harold.
Well, we're just working at it, but you're trying to get this thing, but thanks a lot. And everyone's encouraged to watch, go to Bob's email and to Google him and go to the site. And kelsoinstitute.org is worth looking at. And thank you for viewing. We're coming back again tomorrow. Bob, thanks a lot for coming. Pleasure. So we could run those credits now,
Great. Well, I do hope people take the time to educate themselves on this idea.
I'm not sure. We did that program already. It's in the can, the one we did at the studio.
Right.
And that'll air soon. We'll let people know. We can't say. Probably toward the end of next week.
But this program will come afterwards.
No, this will come first. This will be a lead into that, and then there can get down to the serious thing that you had a chance to really spell it out in a more serious way for the people. And I was ranting here a little bit, so we won't go into that so much.
Your heart's in your work, Harold.
Yes, it is. Okay, yeah, it is. And we got a problem with the timing and the graphics, but that's part of the problem. We can still got a few minutes. Yeah, my heart's in it, and it's a thing that's informed by Fuller and McLuhan and all these other kinds of things outside of that. But that idea at a material level, that binary economic idea, is the principal idea, and I really congratulate you on carrying that forth, and people should pick it up. And it's usually, if you're really interested, certain minds are, if there's something that they don't want you to look at for some reason, that might be the good place to go to look, if you're really trying to find a difference.
The legal strategy is find out what the opposition is trying to hide.
Yes.
The chances are that's where the gold is.
That's right. So stop talking about Mr. Marx and stop talking about Mr., these kind of things, and start going where the goal is, because it's behind this idea that nobody wants to have come up, and they just...
Ownership is key. The left wing has to come to peace with the concept of private property, and the right wing has to come to peace with the notion that concentrated ownership is simply will not work.
Okay, justice. Okay, now...